Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me here today at Re-Written Vintage Homestead. It's a halfway nice day out today. The sun is shining. It's a little windy. It's in the 40s. But the rest of the week, the temperature is really supposed to drop here in the Midwest, and we're supposed to get snow and rain. So while the boys are watching football today, I thought I'd come out here in my cozy she shed and read chapter 12 of the Dollmaker. And if you remember where we ended last time, the family finally made it to Detroit in the heart of Auto City during World War II. So let's get started. Gertie stood, her outspread hands pressed against the door closed behind her. She realized she stood in the kitchen of her new home, but it seemed more like a large closet with rows of uncurtained shelves above a sink and smotheringly crowded with curious things. A few feet in front of her was a doorless doorway into a small hall-like living room. In this room, no more than a dozen feet past the doorway, was another outside door exactly opposite and exactly like the one behind her. The place seemed all walls and halls and doors and windows. "It's so little, Mom. We can't never cook and eat." And Clyde's voice wavered and then died as she stared at the large black heating stove in the corner by the doorway. Gertie continued to stand a moment longer, staring, choking, swallowing, hard to prove to herself that she was not choking. "Well, I figure," she said in a moment, "that it's about 25 feet from the inside to the outside. If it just wasn't broken up so, we can—" Clyde, she realized, had disappeared like the rest of the children. She heard their cries and comments of exploration behind the kitchen walls. She drew a deep breath and then took a few steps to the other outside door. She opened the inner door and scraped a hole of dirt and frost on the outer door. She saw across a narrow strip of sooted black snow another building exactly like her own. Telephone wires and poles, smoke, steel mill light, and steam. She suddenly bent close to the glass, smiling. Quickly she scraped the hole larger, and she looked again. Dim it had been through the steam and the smoke, and far away on the other side of the railroad fence, but it was a hill. She turned away. When seen more clearly, the hill had become a great pile of coal. I grew up in an area very similar. It was housing, and it wasn't really apartments as it was, I suppose you would call today condos, but nothing like condos, believe me. And your house looked like the next house, looked like the next house. They were all the same color, the same yards. You weren't allowed to have pets. Some of the homes had upstairs. Ours was a single level. And some of them had 2 bedrooms, some of them had 3. But your house was exactly like your neighbors. And here in the Midwest, there weren't any hills. It was just flat. And Gertie was almost excited when she scraped the frost off the window, thinking she saw a hill, but it was actually cold. I hope you guys don't mind if the girls come join us. They're thinking about coming in the she shed and listening to a story. She struck her shin bone against a chair as she closed the door. She bent to rub the pain, sharp in her half-numb leg, and in bending her hips, struck a corner of the low head of the cot-like bed. You have to remember, Gertie is a big woman, so it's hard for her to move around in little spaces. There was between the door and the wall, room for the head of the narrow bed, and on the other side of the door, almost room for a chair. Touching the chair was a sofa holding 3 cushions of some slippery, rubbery material. The wood of the sofa, like that of the chair, was a pale but shiny oak. She stood a moment, her hands clenched by her sides, and then carefully walked through the narrow space between the bed and the sofa. 2 halls, scarcely wider than her shoulders, led to the bathroom and the 3 bedrooms. 2 of these were big enough for a double bed and 4 chairs each. The other was smaller still, but into it, single beds were jammed so close together there was no room to walk between them. Clyde bumped her as she turned away. Mom, they ain't no dressers and no looking glass, but I bet there's 20 chairs all alike and just one table for all our cooking and eating. I reckon the government thinks people won't be doing much in their houses but sitting and sleeping. And anyhow, it won't be for long. And she was comforting when Enoch's laughter and Amos's almost frightened scream came from the other side of the kitchen. She bumped into the stove as she whirled toward the sound. Amos, water dripping from his hair, came running with Enoch behind him, explaining between giggles. He climbed into a little box of a thing, Mom, and turned on the round thing, and water squirted all over him. Cassie trailed behind them, whimpering, The water stinks, Mama. It's city water, silly, Clyde explained. It's purified like that in the health books. And that thing in the bathroom, it's a shower like in the catalog. Gertie tried a glass of the water, but after one taste, she emptied it in the sink with a suspicious frown. Ooh, there's something in that besides the water. It's the worst thing on even worse than on the train. Enoch was holding a match he had found above the kitchen sink and begging, Light the gas, Mom. It'll warm up Amos, and we're all freezing. Gertie turned to consider the little cooking stove in a corner of the kitchen. The top was hardly a fourth as big as that of her range cook stove back home, and no warming oven at all. Enoch climbed on the edge of the sink to watch, pointed out the knobs she must turn, and while Clyde warned, Watch out, Mom, Vady Tucker, recollect she'd been in Cincinnati, said a body had to be mighty careful with the gas. Gertie struck a match and held it waveringly, looking first at the row of small black handles, then at the black wall behind. Well, it ain't got no pipe. Maybe it ain't ready to light. Well, I bet gas stoves don't need pipes. Now go on, turn it on, Enoch urged. Well, I don't know which is which, Gertie said, whimpering, a voice that was new to her. Enoch turned a knob just as her match went out. She reached for another while Enoch cried, Hurry up, Mom, I'm turning them all on. She struck the match and held it toward the burners, all hissing now. Flame leaped at her. The corner of the kitchen seemed a wall of flame. She, like the other children, jumped away, but her head struck the corner of a row of open shelves across from the stove. She saw stars and whirling lights and smelled smoke and heard the screams of children. And then Reuben was slapping her forehead. Clyde was throwing a glass of water on her, and Enoch was laughing. Mom, you look so funny. Your hair's all singed. Gertie was silent, rubbing the back of her aching head while she stared at the stovetop where 4 circles of flame flickered and leaped with a faint singing. Enoch reached for another match. Let me light the oven thing, Mom. I'll strike the match and hold it by the holes afore I turn it on. It ain't a want you burned up alive, she said, and took the match and squatted by the open oven door. She bent, searching until her hips touched the opposite side of the cubbyhole and her hair brushed the floor, and saw at last a ring of little holes. She told the children to get a safe distance away, struck the match, and held it under the holes, while the other hand she tried to turn the knob marked oven. Her fingers pulled and twisted, but the knob would not move. The match went out, and she lighted another and tried the knob again. Still, the shiny bit of plastic would not yield. 2 more matches, 2 more tries, and made her fingers even ache, but the little thing was her master still. She stared at it a moment and then got slowly to her feet. Well, I can't do nothing with it, young'uns. I'll build us a fire quick in the heating stove and get the place warm. A large bucket that had once held paint stood by the stove filled with coal. Gertie looked about for kindling. All over the place there was sign of Clovis. The bed with new sheets and blankets where he'd slept, his battered tool chest in a corner, new dishes and a coffee pot, groceries, but no kindling. Reuben went out to the shed, but after what seemed like a long while came back empty-handed and shivering. The little woodshed by the coal house had been so covered with snow he could hardly find the door, and when he found it and clawed the snow away, there had been nothing in it but beer bottles. The tired, hungry, shivering children looked at Gertie. their eyes asking and expecting of her the warmth and food she'd always given them. She stood helplessly staring first at the little knob-marked oven, then at the cold heating stove. Well, jump around a little, she advised at last. That'll keep you warm. It'll help you warm up, and I'll find right behind her, it seemed like, sounded a thumping, bumping thud, and then the child's scream. She whirled, thinking one of her own was hurt, but they were all looking, as she looked, toward the wall of their bedroom by the kitchen. They were all silent, listening, staring at the wall until the scream subsided. If we can hear them that way, they can hear us. Everything we say and do, Clyde whispered at last. Gertie turned again to the heating stove. Well, whatever they are, they're papal, she said. She got a starched apron of brightly beflowered feed sacking from the trunk and said as she tied it on tightly around her waist, I'm aiming to try to bury some kindling from them, strangers or no. Clyde looked at her mother's singed and wind-tangled hair, the smear of gas soot on one cheek. I'll go, Mom. Nobody'd surely mind loaning a little kindling. Gertie frowned over Clyde's bare legs, smoothed her own tangled hair, and at last turned to Reuben. Son, couldn't you go? You're better fixed for the weather than she is. The sullen look on Reuben deepened, but after a moment's hesitation, he went out through the ice-struck, creaking kitchen door. Gertie, with Clyde helping, began to unpack the boxes and baskets. She had got a quilt and put the three younger ones under it on the bed in the room across from the bathroom. When Reuben came back, she saw that he had no kindling and watched worriedly as he closed the door and stood a moment with his back to the room. Then, with no glance at her and stumbling over the things scattered on the floor, he rushed into the little living room like a chased wild animal, hunting for a place to hide. He pressed his face against the glass of the other outside door and stood there for what seemed like a long while. Gertie followed him and patted his shoulder, and at last he was able to tell her in a choked and halting voice what had happened. He had gone to the door on the side where the child had cried. The blind was pulled on the door, but all the same he had knocked. Finally, after he had knocked a second time, a little girl, somewhat bigger than Cassie, had come and lifted up the blind and looked at him. She frowned and shook her head, and then went off again without ever opening the door. He had gone to the next door on the other side. Memories of what had happened there caused him to choke up and clench his hands in anger. Mom, I hadn't knocked real loud, but before I was through, a funny-talking man held something like strange swear words, and he sounded madder than a hornet when I hadn't done nothing but knock. And all the time that same little youngin was watching us. When he come in, why, I don't know why he was watching me or grinning. And when I turned around to come home, he throwed a snowball right in my face, and then he ran off. Now, honey, Gertie said, it won't always be like this. Recollect we'll maybe not be here no time at all. But anyhow, pretty soon you'll be a-going to a big fine school like Meg's youngins has got. Now chirk up. You'll have the little uns feeling bad. She looked around, her sad gray eyes a little brightened when she heard Amos's loud laughter as Enoch, with a great spluttering, whooshing, and banging of chairs, drove one of the big trucks he had just seen. She heard the creaking of the bed, and Cassie knew she mustn't jump on the bed, but this once would warm her up, and she was happy now, calling with the little gurgle like the old Cassie, Look out, big truck, look out, there's a red light. The sounds of the children were suddenly swallowed in a mighty thumping on the wall by the bed, while a voice boomed, Shut off the racket, kids, I gotta sleep. The children scuttled about, bumping into Gertie as she rushed to the bedroom. Cassie gave one last terrified glance toward the wall that had roared, and then buried her face in her mother's apron. Enoch was defiant, and he wanted to know, though in a whisper, why any man would be sleeping in the daytime. And Reuben, his voice hoarse with anger, explained, That's him, Mom. That's the man that yelled at me. Gertie picked up Cassie and Amos and went into the living room. since it, like the kitchen, was in the middle, furthest from the listening walls. She sat with the children on the sofa, the older ones gathered around her. Even Enoch was meek as a sheep and silent. Reuben continued to stand by the front door, but was turned about now, looking at her. Even in the pallid light, there was something worse than anger in his eyes. Pleasure? Didn't he want to say something? It serves you right for not buying the Tipton place. A gust of wind cried in the telephone wires and then shrieked in the chimney, and Cassie snuggled cold against her, begging, "Let's go home, Mom, please. Please, Mom, can we go home? It's so cold." Clyde, already troubled and half frightened by Reuben's story, suddenly flopped down on the cot and dissolved into sobs, while Amos screwed up his face and got ready to break into a bawl. Gertie knew it was a sin to waste any kind of light in the daytime, but maybe some light would make the cold gray place seem warmer. She pulled the cord hanging from an unshaded bulb in the middle of the ceiling, and at once the hard white light fell over them, and their shadows lay sharp and cold on the bare floor. The cardboard walls shone smooth and dull, of some pale gray-green that made her think of a potato sprout that had never seen the sun. In the light, the stove seemed even bigger and colder and uglier, with its short bent pipe and strange rusty tin skirt. She sprang up, a child on either arm, and turned back towards the bedroom. "I'm aiming to put you young'uns back in bed. You got your shoes off and you'll freeze. I'm aiming to get some kindling somehow." Her voice had dropped to a whisper as she entered the bedroom and slid Cassie into bed. "Now be real quiet," she whispered, giving Cassie, who still clung to her arm, a little push, and at the same time sliding Amos down with her other arm. "You uns don't want that man to—" Cassie's hands had tightened on her arm, and Amos had begun to scream. "I'm afeard I—" The fist, she knew it was a fist, and a big one, bigger than her own, banged again until it seemed the thin cardboard wall would crack, and the voice roared, "Can it, kids, can it now! I'll call the cops. I gotta sleep." Amos screamed more loudly than ever, and the fist banged again. Gertie, with the two of them in her arms, started back towards the living room. Suddenly she turned short about and looked at the wall, still trembling from its blows. "They're afeared and they're cold," she cried, her voice so loud Clyde began a worried slushing. She heard the creak of the bed and a windy sigh. "Don't be all the time scaring little kids. I'm trying to build them a fire. I can't find no kindling," she said. More sighs, and then a knocking, low now, as if to call attention to his presence. "There's boards in my shed, but you gotta split 'em." "Well, I'd be much obliged," Gertie said, knowing more from the tone of his voice and his words that he offered what she needed. She shook her head in wonder over the "okay" that followed, but whispered to the children, now more mystified than frightened, to be still and let the sick man sleep. She took from his shed that adjoined her own 3 good-sized, strangely sharp chunks of maple wood, harder and finer grained than any she had ever seen. She got the hatchet from Clovis's tool chest and went out to do the splitting. She had just finished one of the chunks when she realized that the same red-headed child who had watched their coming in now stood bareheaded and coatless as he watched over a bottle of Coca-Cola tilted to his mouth. His blue, marble-like eyes were accusing as he said, taking the bottle from his mouth, "You got that out of Victor's shed, and he's going to get you." "He knows," she said, annoyed by his new business of being watched. "I've got to get my young'uns warm. Ma keeps her oven on when she ain't got no coal." "Well, I couldn't," she said. He finished the dirt-colored liquid and then looked about for a bit of wind-swept sidewalk. He found a bare spot and flung the bottle hard against it. He did not smile, but something like satisfaction glittered in his eyes as he looked from the sharp-edged fragments to Gertie, staring at the glass with her mouth wide open and her hatchet uplifted. "Won't burn," he said, now studying the wood that was damp. "You hillbilly," he went on, looking again at Gertie, unsmiling, nodding a little like a child who had just got the right answer to a problem in arithmetic. But I'll tell Maggie Ewan's code, he said, running away. Gertie was gathering up the kindling when she realized that just behind her was somebody else watching. She looked around and saw, standing knee deep in the drifted snow behind her door, and that of the man who had pounded, a smallish girl like woman, her face rising above two sacks of groceries, clasped one on either arm across her stomach. Her eyes, large and a peculiarly, that's a hard word, light, almost golden brown, were fixed on Gertie in a speculative sort of way. She held her head tipped slightly sideways as she looked at her, gum still between her small front teeth, sharp looking and white like those of a child behind the softly curved woman's lips. A gust of wind screamed down the alley, banging unhooked storm doors in and out, whirling snow and the woman, so that she for an instant seemed to face only peering at Gertie through the snow. Gertie stopped for a bit of kindling, and behind her the woman's voice came, low and pretty, after the sounds from the child and the pounding of the man. What you dream about last night? Can you guys imagine how absolutely terrified they must have been? They're in a new place, very small, very dirty. It doesn't have the amenities that they're used to, being warmth, number one. They're crammed in there together. There's a man, they don't know who it is, beating on the wall. There's a little kid outside drinking a soda pop, watching them. And then when he gets done, smashes it on the sidewalk. And then all of a sudden, there's a woman just standing there, a pretty woman, very sweet, asking Gertie if she has a dream. I mean, you'd want to go hide in a corner and not come out for sure. Gertie considered staring at her, little she was, and dressed in boots, pants, and a plain dark blue jacket. But even with the wind blowing snow all over her and groceries hiding her breast, the womanliness of her was plain. She made her think of a heifer she had once. Even when the heifer was little and unbred, a body could see that the femaleness of it across a wild field. Well, I didn't, Gertie said. She hadn't slept. She couldn't dream. But the eyes needed a dream. The brown woman was like a dream now. Paradise, Gertie said. Paradise, the woman said, rolling her gum once and then holding it still. Her eyes were speculative again, but almost at once the girl was satisfied. Paradise, she said, nodding her head. She turned toward the steps behind her and then called as she fitted her key into the door. Do y'all got salt? Salt, Gertie said, gathering up the last of the kindling. She never answered, but was out again in a moment, a shiny pot in her hands. Rock salt, she said. You gotta salt your steps, or you'll break your neck. And she flung the little salt rocks on the steps and up and down the walk. Gertie remembered later that she had thanked her for neither salt nor kindling. Enoch had stuck his head out, shouting, I fixed the old contrary bake oven, Mom. You push in that knob of the thing, and then she turns looky. Gertie, coming in with the kindling, smiled. There was room for only one chair, and that sideways to the oven door, but on it Clyde sat with Cassie in her lap and Amos in Cassie's lap, so that 3 pairs of cold feet were on the let-down oven door. The taste of fresh outdoor air only resharpened the close, sickly smell of the indoors, thicker now with the oven going. Gertie hurried to start the fire in the heating stove. She had put one match to the damp pile of kindling and watched it go out, and was lighting another, wishing for a little coal oil, when someone knocked on the door, and even Enoch looked a little worried, and Clyde scolded in whispers, You young'uns have been making way too much noise. Enoch had the door only part way open when there came soft, bubbly laughter that made Gertie think of Cassie. And then, more as if blown in than walking, came a slim girl. with a white cloth tied over her hair, black as Rubens, but fine and soft, curling down almost to her waist when she shook her head quickly to make it right itself after the wind. It's wild out there, the girl said, smiling as if she loved wild weather. Gertie struck another match. It makes a body need a fire. Francis, he's my little brother, said you were cold. She came over to the heating stove and peered in. I couldn't find no kindling, but I got you some newspapers and bacon grease, and that's what we use. From Mrs. Bonarita. She handed Gertie newspapers and small pieces of some flimsy dry wood. She then dropped a piece of cardboard holding a great gob of bacon grease, good enough for biscuit making, down into the stove. Gertie frowned on the waste of that good grease, and her knife hesitated above the gift of wood. Honey, she said, studying it, ain't this a piece of some kind of toy? The girl shrugged her shoulders. It ain't no good, just part of an old doll bed. But when she looked up at Gertie, there was in her eyes bright blue and set under lashes as long and as black as Cassie's, a something like sorrow for a broken bed, and her voice was impatient for the hurt to be finished quickly as she insisted. Go on, break it up. It'll make good kindling, dry like it is. It'll keep on you the top shelf hall where the kids could find it, and I mean someday to try to glue it back, but now I'm just too big for a doll bed. So this girl broke up her little doll bed so that they could have kindling. Why, honey, you're not so old, Gertie said. She broke the flimsy wood, but glanced swiftly at the face down bent as the eyes followed the broken toy into the stove. The girl watched an instant and then turned sharply towards the kitchen door. She seemed a very little child when, after looking through the half of the kitchen window left from the icebox, she exclaimed, You know, if you don't look high up, you can think you got a tree there where there's a telephone pole. Some of the units, they do have trees close. On the other side, though, of the street, there's really big trees. And then there's one girl that I'm friends with. She's got two big trees right in her front yard, all her own, but they keep it private. Private? Gertie asked. Well, you know, it's a real house all by itself. I bet you're glad to get out of in a big place like this with lots of room and kind of quiet. Gertie gave out a little laugh, crying eyes, a quick suspicious glance. Well, I wouldn't call it so big and neither quiet, she said. And seeing how we started out to it, I reckon we're real glad you're here. Well, you ought to be glad, the girl said. I bet you got pulled. You come to Detroit straight to a big 3-bedroom place like this? These houses, they're good and warm and the rent's cheap, and they're the only places in Detroit where they keep you, I'm not going to say it, you guys. It's a derogatory word that I don't say in real life either, so I'm not going to say it. But they keep them out into the last neighborhood where we lived, and there came a banging on the door that threatened to break the glass, and a child's shrill cry of, Tell Maggie Daly if she's here, she better get. The girl reached for the door, but before she could open it, the bottle breaker had swung it wide and was shouting, Get home, Maggie, get home. Pat and Jim's in a water fight, and water's all over it. You better get. I'll be there, Maggie said, unflustered, smiling as she turned and explained to Gertie that her mother had gone shopping for the day, and she was staying home from high school to mind the younger children. She pulled a small pink slip of heavy paper from her jacket pocket, held it out to Gertie. Wouldn't she like you a ticket to the bingo party? There's door prizes and everything. Donations only 25 cents. It's all for the good sisters, a new piano that they need. Gertie started to shake her head, and then she remembered the grease and the doll bed kindling. Reluctantly, she reached into her pocket and fished out a quarter. Maggie hurried away, for Francis was screaming again. So the little girl's name is Maggie. She's actually in high school. She takes care of her younger siblings. She seems like a very sweet girl. Gertie gave her 25 cents to go play bingo. So we're learning some new characters here. The woman who wanted a dream, She was the wife of the man who was beating on the door. She seems like a really sad type of character. And although he comes across as mean because he's banging, and telling them to be quiet, he actually breaks down and tells Gertie where to get kindling wood. So he must be not as bad as what he came across as. The children crowded around and studied the card when the girl was gone. But to all their questions of what was bingo, who were the good sisters, and what did Maggie have on the little thin chain around her neck, Gertie could only shake her head. Clyde said, looking happier, "Wasn't she pretty, Ma? And not a bit stuck up. Can I have some overall pants like hers? They'd be good to keep a body's legs warm." The fire was singing soon and not loud as the wind in the telephone wires, but with a good hearty crinking of iron and hissing of flame, and Gertie began the job of feeding the children out of the curious packages Clovis had left on the kitchen table. Tin cans she had seen, but never milk in a bottle. The children were all warm now, and all, even Reuben, happier after the coming of Maggie, crowded around her, hungry for bread and milk. Clyde got glasses, and the 3 quarts of milk and 2 loaves of bread were gone in an instant. Only Cassie wrinkled her nose and declared the milk tasted funny. "Well, it's pasteurized, silly," Clyde said, "like in them health books at school." "And it's made in a factory," Enoch said. "But they's a cow somehow behind it," Clyde said. And while they argued, there came another knocking low down on the door, like a kicking, sharp and insistent, as if the person were in a great hurry, but hurry or no, determined to come in. Gertie shoved the outer door open just as a small foot in an open-toed, high-heel slipper below a bare ankle hooked itself around the corner and began to pull. A dried-up, puny-looking woman came through the door, a steaming pot in one hand, a steaming skillet in the other. The arm of the hand that held the pot held together a bathrobe of some blue silk material quilted into a design of flowers and embroidered with golden peacocks. In spite of her eyes being squinted against the smoke of the cigarette in one corner of her mouth, she managed to smile as she held the pot toward Gertie. Her hand, free of the pot, took the cigarette, and she blew 2 long rolls of smoke down through her nostrils. Rolls so long that Enoch looked at her in admiration. Clyde stood still with a glass of milk halfway to her mouth, choking a little from the too hasty swallowing of the soft bread, and stared at the woman's toenails.